An elderly woman, humbled by a wealthy baker when she asked for bread for her sick granddaughter, but her old horse reacted in a way nobody expected. A chance photograph changed their lives forever, revealing secrets from the past and forgotten talents. A story of dignity, tradition, and cross-species connection. Get ready because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. The sun dipped below the horizon as the first wave reached the shore, gentle, almost hesitant, as if asking permission to touch the sand. Then came another, more confident, leaving a trail of white foam that shimmered in the orange glow of the sunset. The beach was deserted, except for a solitary figure walking barefoot along the water's edge, leaving footprints that were quickly erased by the following waves, ephemeral marks of existence that the ocean gently wiped away. On her face, etched by time and sun, Grandma Hope's eyes reflected the same deep blue of the sea she gazed upon. There was something hypnotic about the movement of the water, an ancient rhythm she knew as well as the beat of her own heart. In her right hand, she held a small ivory spiral shell, so small it almost disappeared between her fingers. Occasionally, she brought it to her ear, as if listening to a secret only she could understand. The salty wind ruffled her grey hair as the sky shifted from gold to a gradient of purple and deep blue. The first stars began to appear, shyly, as if testing the territory before revealing their full brilliance. On the horizon, a fishing boat returned to the harbour of Sea Breeze Cove, a dark silhouette against the sky, its navigation light blinking like a marine firefly. Hope stopped and closed her eyes. The breath of the sea, the inhalation and exhalation of waves, synchronized with her own breathing. It was a moment of silent communion, interrupted only by the distant cry of a lone seagull returning to its nest. When she opened her eyes again, a single tear rolled down her cheek, mingling with the salty spray the wind carried. It wasn't a tear of sadness nor of joy. It was simply the liquid expression of an emotion as vast and deep as the ocean that stretched before her. The shell in her hand seemed to pulse. Hope held it up against the last rays of the sun, watching as the light passed through the calcareous material, revealing veins and patterns invisible to the naked eye. There were whole worlds within that small spiral, just as there were universes within her own being waiting to be discovered. With a sigh that carried the weight of decades, she tucked the shell into the pocket of her worn shawl and turned. The town's lighthouse began to cast its circular beam, projecting a golden shaft that swept across the surface of the sea at precise intervals. It was time to go home, to the small cottage on the hill that watched over the ocean like a silent guardian. Tomorrow would be another day, identical to this one, just like all the others had been since she was left alone. At least, that's what Hope thought as night fell upon the sea and her soul. Hope's cottage clung to the rocky hillside like a sea swallow's nest, bravely resisting the harsh conditions that battered the coast during winter storms. Made of wood, weathered by salt, and painted a grayish blue that blended with the cloudy sky, it was the kind of place that seemed to have grown naturally from the landscape, as if it had always been there. At dawn, Hope followed a routine unchanged for almost 2 decades. She woke with the first ray of sunlight that penetrated her frosted glass window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like luminescent plankton. The wooden floor creaked under her bare feet as she walked to the small kitchen where the earthenware pot, a family heirloom, was already positioned over the wood-burning stove. The aroma of strong coffee filled the cottage's unique atmosphere, mingling with the scent of old wood and used books stacked haphazardly in the corners. The walls were decorated with yellowed photographs, antique nautical charts, and an impressive collection of seashells and sea stones, each with a story and a place of origin known only to Hope. Sitting in the rocking chair by the window that offered a panoramic view of the ocean, Hope savored her coffee while watching the seagulls circling over the morning waves. There was something ritualistic about this time of day, a pause before the world fully awoke. On the horizon, fishing boats set out for their daily work, tiny against the vast blue expanse. Loneliness wasn't an unwelcome visitor for Hope, but a constant companion she had learned to accommodate in her life. After her husband's passing, taken not by choice but by the inevitable call of the sea during a fierce storm, she had slowly built an existence parallel to the ocean that both gave and took. In Hope's green eyes, now framed by expressive wrinkles, there was a quiet acceptance of that balance between loss and continuity. Her hands, marked by work and time, moved skillfully as she arranged her craft supplies on the oak table in the center of the room. Hope created small sculptures using materials brought in by the sea, wood polished by the waves, glass transformed by the sand, worn ropes from lost ships. Each piece told a fragmented story, an echo of interrupted lives and journeys that she recomposed into new visual narratives. The fishing village at the foot of the hill rarely saw her. When she went down to buy groceries, conversations would momentarily cease, followed by respectful greetings and kind but distant smiles. To the locals, Hope was almost an extension of the landscape, the woman from the blue cottage, the fisherman's widow, the seashell artisan, a romantic and slightly mysterious figure who preferred the company of the sea to that of humans. In the afternoons, after hours spent crafting items she sold to a few souvenir shops in Monterey, Hope descended to the beach by a winding path known only to her and the wild animals that inhabited the hillside. It was the time of day when the sun created a golden path on the water, a bridge of light that seemed to invite crossing to somewhere beyond the visible horizon. On the beach, Hope collected new shells and observed the tide pools, small contained universes where tiny crabs, anemones, and starfish revealed the extraordinary complexity of marine life. There was a comforting predictability in these microcosms that she studied with the patience and curiosity of an amateur scientist. At night, with a glass of mezcal she sipped slowly, Hope sat on the porch of her cottage and watched the constellations that dotted the sky, like an infinite collection of luminous shells. The sound of the waves rose up the hillside, a constant and ancient lullaby, the same song that cradled her restless dreams, where she often saw herself swimming in deep waters, searching for something indefinable, always near, but never attainable. It was a life of patterns, cycles, and repetitions, an existence that flowed like the tide, predictable in its rhythm, but always carrying small variations that only a keen observer would notice. Hope had become that kind of observer, not only of the sea and its creatures, but also of herself and the slow process of transformation that time wrought on her essence. She had found a form of peace in that constancy, although sometimes her heart secretly yearned for something she couldn't name. The storm arrived without warning, one of those autumnal maritime furies that seemed to awaken from the ocean's very heart. The sky darkened in minutes, as if someone had spilled ink on a blue canvas. The waves, once docile, transformed into walls of water that advanced against the coast with roars that shook the cottage windows. Hope was finishing lacquering a wooden sculpture, a quetzal in full flight, when the first thunderclaps broke the afternoon silence. She rarely got scared by storms, but there was something different about this one, a primal ferocity, an urgency in the way the wind howled through the cracks in the house. Putting aside her work, she went to the window. Outside, the familiar landscape had transformed. The sea, normally her gentle confidant, now showed its most terrifying face. Trees bent like forced bows to the power of unleashed nature. In the distance, the lighthouse lit prematurely, its yellow light barely penetrating the curtain of rain that was forming. Hope checked the window and door latches, lit the fireplace to combat the sudden chill, and filled an oil lamp, preparing for the inevitable power outage. As the storm increased its fury outside, she settled into her armchair with an old book on navigation that she read and reread on stormy days. As a kind of personal ritual, that's when she heard the noise. Different from the sounds of the storm, this was organic, alive, a sharp sound, almost a lament that seemed to come from the beach below. Hope hesitated, trying to convince herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her imagination, but the sound returned, fainter this time, almost swallowed by the roar of the waves. Without a second thought, Hope put on her waterproof serape, grabbed a lantern, and went out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down as she closed the door behind her. The rain lashed her face like tiny icy needles, but she pressed on, determined, along the slippery path leading to the beach. The descent down the hillside was dangerous under normal conditions. During a storm it bordered on insanity, but Hope knew every stone, every root, every curve of that path. Her feet moved with the assurance of muscle memory, while her mind was focused on the strange sound that had called her out. When she finally reached the beach, the scene was apocalyptic. Gigantic waves crashed against the rocks, throwing up white foam that the wind carried away like furious ghosts. The sand was strewn with seaweed, pieces of wood, and other debris that the churning sea regurgitated. Hope scanned the tide line with her lantern, her eyes narrowed against the relentless rain. That's when she saw it. Partially covered by a pile of seaweed, a dark body moved weakly. Approaching cautiously, she discovered it was a golden eagle, one of the great navigators of the skies, now fallen and injured. The bird, magnificent even in its pitiful state, had one wing twisted at an unnatural angle. Its black, bright eyes fixed on Hope with disconcerting intensity, as if assessing her intentions. It showed no fear, only a wounded dignity that deeply touched Hope's heart. With slow, deliberate movements, Hope removed her serape and used it to carefully wrap the large bird. Surprisingly, the eagle didn't resist. Perhaps it was too weak, or perhaps it instinctively understood that this human represented its only chance of survival. The way back to the cottage was a struggle against the elements and the extra weight she carried. Several times Hope slipped, regaining her balance at the last moment, always protecting her precious burden against her chest. The eagle remained still throughout the journey, only its rapid heartbeat against Hope's hands indicating that it was still alive. Once inside the safety of the cottage, Hope placed the bird on the kitchen table and examined its injuries under the lamplight. The wing was dislocated but not broken, a small miracle considering the violence of the storm. There were also some cuts on its snow-white chest where feathers had been torn out. Using knowledge gained over the years observing fishermen treat seabirds accidentally caught in their nets, Hope cleaned the wounds with warm salt water and applied a paste of healing herbs she kept for her own cuts and scrapes. With surprising gentleness for hands hardened by work, she immobilized the injured wing with an improvised splint and bandages. Throughout the procedure, the eagle kept its eyes fixed on her, without blinking, as if witnessing something extraordinary, an encounter between two worlds that rarely crossed in such an intimate way. There was an awareness in that gaze that transcended simple biology, something ancient and wise that resonated with the ocean's own spirit. When she finished her care, Hope prepared a makeshift bed for the bird using a box lined with soft blankets. She placed a small dish of fresh water and another with pieces of fish she had saved for her own dinner. The eagle accepted the water but refused the food, understandable considering the recent trauma. The storm continued to roar outside throughout the night, but inside the cottage, a strange peace had settled. Hope slept in the armchair near the eagle, waking occasionally to check on its condition. In one of those moments, she found the bird watching her in the darkness, its eyes reflecting the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace like tiny black stars. "You're a traveler of the great skies," Hope murmured, more to herself than to the bird. "You've seen things I can only imagine. And now we're here, two survivors, two lonely souls united by the storm." At dawn, when the last vestiges of the storm dispersed on the horizon, leaving behind a clear sky and a reluctantly pacified sea, Hope sensed that something had changed, not only in the outside world but within her, as if a long-closed door had been opened by the fierce wind, allowing a ray of light to penetrate long-darkened chambers of her heart. The following days established a new rhythm in Hope's previously mechanical life. The eagle, which she began to call Sky, like the infinite expanse that was its true home, gradually grew stronger under her attentive care. The routine now included bandage changes, gentle exercises for the injured wing, and long hours of mutual contemplation. At first, Hope kept a respectful distance, understanding that the majestic bird's recovery depended as much on space as on proximity. She gave it fresh food, small fish she bought directly from the fishermen in town, going down there more frequently than in recent years, and watched with quiet satisfaction when Sky finally began to feed itself. The original box soon proved inadequate for a being accustomed to traveling infinite distances. Hope rearranged her living room, creating a spacious area near the window that offered a view of the sea. There, on a wooden structure covered with soft cotton, Sky could rest while observing its natural element, like an exiled king contemplating his distant kingdom. "Eagles can fly for hours without hardly flapping their wings," Hope commented, while working on her sculptures, now with Sky as an attentive spectator. "I imagine how difficult it must be for you to be confined here." The bird tilted its head slightly, as if understanding her words. "But I promise that as soon as you're recovered, I'll return you to the skies." It was curious how Hope, who had for so long limited herself to internal monologues, now found herself verbalizing thoughts and observations to her feathered companion. Even more curious was how this didn't seem strange or forced, but natural, as if Sky were the interlocutor she had always needed, someone who listened without judging, who understood without words. One afternoon, as a fine rain gently drummed on the cottage roof, Hope sat on the floor near Sky's makeshift perch and began to read aloud from an old book about Aztec navigators and their star-guided journeys. The eagle, which normally maintained an alert posture, visibly relaxed, its eyes half closed in apparent appreciation. "You must know a lot about navigation, don't you?" Hope smiled, marking the page with a quill she had found on the beach. "Maybe you could teach me what the books don't explain. What it's like to feel the wind supporting you over the blue abyss, what it's like to sleep while soaring over clouds that could envelop entire mountains." Days turned into weeks. Sky's wing healed faster than Hope had anticipated. Soon it began to cautiously extend it, testing its recovered strength. Hope observed these exercises with a mixture of joy and apprehension, happy about the recovery, but already anticipating the absence that would come with the inevitable departure. The relationship between the two evolved subtly and constantly. Sky, initially wary when Hope approached to change its bandages, now allowed her to gently stroke its mahogany and gold feathers. There was a tacit exchange of trust that transcended the barrier between species, a mutual recognition of kindred spirits, both familiar with vastness and solitude. One particularly clear morning, when the sun seemed to wash the world with golden light, Hope opened all the windows of the cottage to let the fresh breeze circulate. Sky stirred more than usual, stretching its neck outward, its nostrils expanding to catch the scents of the mountains that the wind carried. Hope smiled sadly. "You feel it, don't you? The call." She approached the bird and gently removed the last bandages that still partially restricted its movements. "It's time to properly test that wing." She took Sky outside, carefully carrying it to the hill behind the cottage, where the wind was stronger, ideal for a first experimental flight. Her heart pounding with conflicting emotions, Hope raised her arms, offering the eagle the opportunity to leave. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Sky remained motionless, its black eyes fixed on Hope's with disturbing intensity. Then, in a fluid movement, it leaped into the air, its enormous wings fully extended for the first time since the rescue. The first wing beat was hesitant, uncertain. The second, more confident. On the third, Sky was already gaining altitude, circling above Hope in ascending spirals. Hope laughed and cried simultaneously, shielding her eyes from the sun as she accompanied her friend's restored flight. She expected to see it disappear over the horizon, a quick and definitive separation, like so many others in her life. But to her surprise, after a few minutes of aerial freedom, Sky returned, gracefully landing a few feet from her. Hope remained motionless, fearing that any movement might frighten it. But Sky simply folded its majestic wings and approached her with the clumsy gait characteristic of its species on firm ground. When it reached her, it gently tilted its head against her outstretched hand, a gesture that seemed to say, "I'm not ready to leave yet." That night, as they watched the sunset together from the cottage porch, Hope realized that something extraordinary had happened. Sky had chosen to stay, at least for now. A being born for the infinite freedom of the skies had voluntarily opted for her company. In the following days, a new routine was established. In the morning, Hope opened the door and Sky went out for its flights, being absent for hours, sometimes the whole day. Invariably, it returned at sunset, often bringing small gifts, an unusual herb, a small flowering branch, that it deposited near Hope's feet. The villagers soon noticed the strange association. The eagle that accompanied the solitary woman from the cottage became the subject of conversations and speculation. Some viewed the situation with superstition. Golden eagles were known as messengers of the gods in local traditions. Others, more practical, simply found the unusual bond between woman and bird fascinating. For Hope, the opinions of others mattered little. What happened between her and Sky was something private, almost sacred, a silent communication based on presence and mutual acceptance. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel truly alone, and she suspected that, in some mysterious and profound way, Sky felt the same. On full moon nights when the ocean shimmered as if containing submerged stars, Hope noticed how Sky watched the horizon with redoubled intensity. In those moments, she knew that he was torn between two calls, that of infinite freedom and that of the connection they had formed. In those moments, she whispered to him, "It's okay to leave when the time comes. Some encounters don't need to be eternal to be perfect." And so, day after day, In shared silences and small daily rituals, their loneliness transformed into something different, not exactly its opposite, but a new form of existence where the presence of the other didn't diminish individuality, but only added depth and texture to previously monochromatic worlds. Summer arrived with unusual intensity for that coastal region, bringing skies of an almost painfully blue and heat that made the air shimmer above the rocks. For Hope and Sky, the long sunny days meant more time spent together on the beach and under the shade of nearby trees, where the woman would often read while the eagle perched on low branches, occasionally taking flight to perform aerial acrobatics that seemed to amuse them both. It was on one of those bright mornings that Hope noticed a change in Sky's behavior. The eagle, normally attentive and receptive, was restless, frequently turning its neck towards the mountains as if hearing a call inaudible to human ears. Its daily flights became longer, returning only when the sun had already set, seeming increasingly reluctant to return to the cottage. "Something's calling you," Hope murmured one night, gently stroking Sky's head feathers as it settled on its perch near the open window. "The others of your kind, perhaps." She had read enough to know that golden eagles were creatures that formed lifelong pairs, and that mating season was approaching. The prospect of Sky's definite departure provoked conflicting feelings in Hope. On the one hand, she knew it was the natural course. He belonged to the open skies, to the great mountain winds, not to a domesticated life alongside a solitary woman. On the other hand, the idea of returning to her previous existence, without the silent but profoundly comforting presence of her winged friend, tightened her heart like an invisible hand. On a particularly hot afternoon, Hope decided to climb to the abandoned viewpoint at the highest point of the coast, a place she rarely visited because of the associated memories. It was there that she and her husband used to meet before their marriage, when he was still just a young fisherman and she the daughter of the old lighthouse keeper. Sky accompanied her, alternating between circular flights and close landings as if standing guard. The stone structure of the viewpoint stood out against the sky, partially covered with vines and marked by abandonment, since modern tourism had rendered its primary function obsolete. Hope sat at the base of the circular tower, feeling the hot stone against her back as she contemplated the spectacular panorama that unfolded. The crescent-shaped bay, the distant cliffs, and above all, the infinite horizon, where sky and sea merged into an imprecise line. That's when she noticed the dark spots in the southern sky, dozens of them gradually approaching. At first she thought they were distant clouds, but she soon recognized the characteristic flight pattern: eagles, a whole flock, traveling in loose formation towards the mountains where they nested. Sky saw them too. One moment it was perched near Hope. The next it launched into the air with a powerful wing beat, rapidly gaining altitude. Hope watched, impressed, as it flew directly to meet the group, its elegant figure standing out against the intense blue. When Sky reached the formation, there seemed to be a moment of recognition. Some birds veered slightly to include it, adjusting the formation. For several minutes, Sky flew among its peers, before separating again and returning to where Hope watched, now with a lump in her throat. "It's your family," she whispered, when it landed a few feet away. "They're migrating to the mountains, aren't they? And they came for you." The eagle didn't answer, obviously, but its behavior in the following hours was eloquent. A growing agitation, a restlessness that Hope had never witnessed before. She understood then that the moment she always knew would be inevitable had arrived. That night, she prepared a special dinner for both of them. Grilled fresh fish for herself, the most delicate parts carefully separated for Sky. They ate in a silence laden with meaning, under the golden light of the oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the cottage walls. "It's okay," Hope finally said, her voice barely betraying the contained emotion. "I know you need to go with them. It's your nature, your family, your destiny." The word family came out heavier than the others, a concept that hadn't been part of her reality for a long time. Sky approached, in one of those rare moments when it seemed to deliberately break the barrier between their species. It allowed Hope to stroke its golden feathers, closing its eyes momentarily in a gesture of absolute trust. "You've taught me something important," Hope continued, the words flowing like water from a long-sealed spring. "That true connections aren't prisons, they're bridges. They allow us to move freely, knowing that there's always a place where we're understood even if we're worlds apart." That was a night of unspoken farewell. Hope left the windows open, as she always did, but she knew this time was different. Lying in her bed, She listened to the gentle flapping of wings that indicated that Sky was still in the cottage, seemingly as reluctant as she was to close that chapter of their lives. Morning brought a clear sky, and the distant sound of the flock of eagles circling patiently over the mountains. Hope got up at dawn and found Sky already awake, watching the horizon from the living room window. Without words, she opened the door and went out to the small stone patio, followed by the eagle, which moved with a new urgency in its clumsy gait on land. The rising sun transformed the sea into a plain of liquid gold, and the wind carried the unmistakable scent of salt and promise. Hope knelt before Sky, her eyes level with the birds. "Go," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible under the sound of the waves. "They're waiting for you." As if understanding perfectly, Sky leaned forward, briefly touching its beak to Hope's face, a gesture as gentle as it was unexpected, almost a caress. Then, with a powerful thrust, it launched into the air, its enormous wings catching the morning wind. Hope remained motionless, watching as Sky gained altitude, its circles gradually becoming wider. When the eagle finally headed towards the mountains, joining the distant flock, she didn't look away until the last golden silhouette disappeared against the infinite horizon. The cottage felt strangely empty that night. Hope moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, touching the objects that had been part of their shared routine: the makeshift perch, the dish she used to feed Sky, the soft brush with which she occasionally smoothed its feathers. The eagle's absence was a tangible presence, a silence that weighed on the space like morning mist. In the days that followed, Hope gradually returned to her previous routine: the crafts, the walks on the beach, the occasional visits to the village. But something had irrevocably changed. She was no longer the same woman who had lived for so long in voluntary isolation, contenting herself with the company of inanimate objects and memories. Sky had reopened a door within her, the ability to form connections, to allow another being to penetrate the protective cocoon she had built around her heart. Paradoxically, its departure didn't represent an absolute loss, but a transformation, like the tide itself, which recedes only to return in a new cycle. The following winter, the coast was battered by a relentless sequence of storms. They weren't furious and dramatic like the one that had brought Sky, but persistent, transforming the days into a monotonous succession of grey skies and horizontal rains that lashed against the cottage windows. The sea, normally a sympathetic ally in Hope's solitude, had become a tempestuous neighbor, stealing large portions of the beach and threatening the paths leading to the village. On one of those gloomy afternoons, when visibility was reduced to a few meters and the wind moaned through the cracks in the house like a wounded animal, Hope received an unexpected visit. The sound of urgent knocks on the door was almost lost in the roar of the storm, but something, perhaps the same instinct that had guided her to Sky on that fateful night, made her perceive the call. Opening the door, she found Mrs. Luce drenched and trembling, her face pale with worry. "The lower part of the village is flooding," she explained through chattering teeth. "The creek overflowed. They're evacuating the houses closest to the shore." Hope acted quickly, changing her house clothes for more resistant ones, preparing a bag with essential items, and following Mrs. Luce downhill along a path that became more treacherous with each step. The wind pushed them sideways, the rain obscured their vision, but they continued to advance, guided by the distant lights of the village and the urgency of the situation. When they finally reached the village, Hope barely recognized the familiar streets. Dark water flowed through the normally dry paths, carrying branches, debris, and occasionally personal belongings swept away from the most affected houses. Local residents and volunteers formed human chains, passing buckets, moving furniture, building improvised barriers with sandbags. "What can we do?" Hope asked old Mr. Miguel, who coordinated the efforts with the natural authority of someone who has known the sea and its moods since childhood. "The school is serving as a shelter," he replied, pointing towards the stone building on the highest point of the village. "We need help organizing the evacuated families, mainly the elderly and children." Hope nodded and headed in that direction, surprised by her own determination. For 2 decades, she had kept the community at a distance, visiting the village only when absolutely necessary, avoiding involvement and connections. Now she found herself at the epicenter of collective action, working shoulder to shoulder with people she barely knew by name. In the school, improvised as a shelter, organized chaos reigned. Crying children, worried elders, young people running back and forth with blankets and food. Hope instinctively gravitated towards a corner where a woman was trying to calm a group of small children, clearly overwhelmed. "Can I help?" Hope offered, kneeling at the children's level. Before the other woman could respond, Hope had already pulled the small spiral shell she always carried with her from her pocket. "Do you know that shells keep the sound of the sea inside them?" The children's eyes, moments ago filled with tears, widened with curiosity. Hope passed the shell among them, showing them how to hold it to their ear to listen to the ocean. The simple distraction worked like magic, transforming fear into fascination. "Would you like to hear a story about the sea and a very special bird?" Hope asked, surprised by her own offer. The children nodded enthusiastically, forming a semicircle around her. And so, under the distant roar of the storm that continued outside, Hope shared the story of Sky for the first time with a wider audience. Her voice, initially hesitant, gained firmness as she recounted the rescue, the recovery, the moments of silent connection, and finally the necessary departure. The children listened with that total attention that only the very young can offer, while nearby adults were gradually drawn to the narrative, forming an outer circle of listeners. When she finished, Hope noticed that the previously tense space had transformed. The storm continued, the situation remained precarious, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the shelter, an almost tangible quality of concentrated calm, like the eye of a hurricane. "Do you have more stories, Mom?" asked a little girl with messy braids, her eyes pleading for more. Hope hesitated only a moment before smiling. "Many more. The sea is full of them." In the hours that followed, as the storm reached its peak and slowly began to subside, Hope continued to tell stories. Some learned from her fisherman husband, others from old books on navigation, and some that seemed to spontaneously form in her mind, inspired by the treasures the sea had deposited on her beach over the years. When morning finally arrived, bringing with it a pale sun struggling to penetrate the remaining clouds, Hope found herself transformed in the eyes of the community. She was no longer just the strange, solitary woman from the cottage on the hill, but Mrs. Hope, the storyteller, whose words had built a bridge over the turbulent waters of shared adversity. In the following days, as the village slowly recovered from the flood damage, Hope remained at the center of community efforts. Her artisan hands proved useful, not only for creating beauty from marine debris, but also for repairing, rebuilding, restoring. Her cottage, strategically positioned high on the hillside, became a meeting point for planning and occasionally for moments of rest for exhausted workers. It was during one of these impromptu meetings that old Mr. Miguel settled in a chair on Hope's porch with a cup of strong coffee in his gnarled hands, casually observed, "You know, we need someone to document the history of this town, our traditions, our knowledge of the sea, before they disappear with old folks like me." The others present murmured in agreement, and several glances turned significantly towards Hope, who felt an unexpected warmth rise from her neck to her cheeks. I'm not a writer," she protested. "But you know stories," Mr. Miguel replied simply. "And more importantly, you know how to tell them in a way that makes people want to listen. I would need to interview people, collect memories. And would that be a problem for you?" Mrs. Luz asked softly. Well aware of Hope's tendency towards isolation, Hope looked at the circle of faces that now watched her expectantly. Faces that just a few months ago would have been practically strangers, but which she now began to recognize not only by their names, but by their particular stories, their struggles, their small daily joys. "No," she finally replied, surprising herself with the simplicity of the answer. "It wouldn't be a problem." The following spring, when the last vestiges of the storm had been repaired and village life returned to its normal routine, Hope officially began the project she secretly called the Tide Archives, a collection of oral histories, maritime traditions, local ecological knowledge, and personal memories from the oldest inhabitants. Every day she walked down to the village with a small recorder and a notebook, sat with retired fishermen on the docks, with elderly ladies who mended nets, with the lighthouse keeper who kept the old system running more out of love for tradition than out of practical necessity in the age of GPS. She listened with total intensity, occasionally asking questions that revealed her intuitive understanding of the sea and its complexities. At night, she worked in her cottage, transforming those conversations into coherent narratives that preserved both the information and the particular flavor of the original voice. Mrs. Luz frequently joined her in these sessions, adding illustrations that complemented the words, Drawings of specific nautical knots, of cloud formations that indicated weather changes, of traditional boat-building techniques that were slowly being forgotten. The project, which initially seemed daunting, proved deeply rewarding. Hope discovered that her ability to listen, cultivated during years of contemplative solitude, was a rare and precious gift. People opened up to her, sharing not only technical knowledge, but also personal stories, fears, hopes, abandoned dreams, and secret ambitions. One particularly significant afternoon, Hope interviewed the widow of the village's former doctor, a woman who, like her, had chosen isolation after loss. The conversation began formally, with questions about the traditional medicinal practices used to treat fishing-related injuries, but gradually transformed into something more personal, more profound. "How did you do it?" the widow asked abruptly, interrupting her own explanation of the use of specific seaweed to treat wounds. "How did you find your way back to the world?" Hope considered the question carefully before answering, understanding its importance. "It wasn't a conscious decision," she finally admitted. "It was a series of small moments. A wounded bird that needed me, a storm that left me no choice but to help. Each moment opened a door that I didn't even realize I had closed." The other woman nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper, "of trying again, of caring, and then losing again," Hope completed, instinctively reaching for the woman's hand. "I know. The fear never completely disappears, but I discovered that there's something worse than the pain of losing." "What?" "The absence of everything. Pain, joy, connection, the neutrality that I mistook for peace for so long." That night, while working on the transcription of that particular interview, Hope realized that the project had become something bigger than the simple preservation of local knowledge. She was creating a fabric of human connections, restoring bridges between past and present, between individuals who had isolated themselves on personal islands of pain or indifference. The work had given her a new purpose, a reason to lift her eyes from her own scars and truly look at others. And in the process, like a slow but inevitable tide, the village was flowing back into its life, filling spaces she didn't even know were empty. At the end of spring, when the first tourist boats began to appear in the bay, Hope concluded the initial phase of the tide archives. The material collected, stories, techniques, ecological observations, superstitions, recipes, sea shanties, was vast and diverse, a cultural treasure that risked disappearing without documentation. Mrs. Luce, whose temporary stay had extended indefinitely, suggested transforming the material into an illustrated book that could be shared not only within the community, but also with visitors and those interested in maritime traditions. The idea immediately gained enthusiastic support from the locals, especially when Luce explained that the profits could fund a small community maritime museum. For Hope, the project represented a new and unexpected challenge, allowing her words, now intertwined with the voices of the community, to travel beyond the safe borders she had established. It was a different kind of vulnerability, but one she now felt ready to embrace. One night, sitting alone on her porch as day slowly transformed into twilight, Hope instinctively searched the horizon for the golden silhouette of outstretched wings. Sky didn't appear physically, but somehow he was present, in the wind that ruffled her hair, in the constant rhythm of the waves, in the newfound courage that now pulsed in her chest. "You taught me well, old friend," she murmured to the sea and sky that merged in the distance. "That some cages are built by ourselves, and that the tides of life are not to be feared, but to be navigated." Summer arrived with an explosion of colors and heat, transforming the village into a coveted destination for tourists escaping suffocating cities. The small harbor, traditionally occupied only by fishing boats, now also accommodated recreational sailboats and occasional yachts, bringing visitors who strolled through the narrow streets with cameras and curiosity. For many locals, the tourist season represented an ambivalent relationship. On the one hand, a necessary economic injection. On the other, a temporary invasion that altered the rhythm and authenticity of the place. Hope, from her privileged position in the cottage on the hill, observed this seasonal transformation with renewed interest, now that she was more connected to community life. The manuscript of the book, based on the tide archives, had been finalized in the spring and was currently going through the editing and design process with the independent publisher that Mrs. Luce had contacted through her professional connections. Meanwhile, without a formal project to occupy her, Hope spontaneously found herself assuming a new role, that of guardian and interpreter of local traditions for genuinely interested visitors. It started casually, a middle-aged couple who found Hope on the beach while she was collecting materials for her sculptures. Intrigued by her knowledge of coastal geological formations, they asked for recommendations on lesser-known places to explore. The conversation evolved into stories about historical shipwrecks and traditional navigation techniques, leaving the visitors delighted. The next day, they returned with friends. The following week, the owner of the local inn shyly asked if Hope would consider leading small educational walks along the coast for selected guests. Initially reluctant, still valuing her privacy, Hope surprised herself by accepting, setting clear limits. Small groups only twice a week, at times that respected both her routine and the natural cycles of the tide. Thus were born the tide walks, as the tourists began to call them. Unlike conventional tourist tours with rehearsed information and predictable photo stops, Hope's excursions were contemplative journeys that revealed deeper layers of the coastal landscape. She showed how to identify the subtle signs that preceded weather changes, taught the names of migratory seabirds, explained how each type of shell told a story about the creature that once inhabited it. In hidden coves, she shared local myths about mermaids and ghost ships, not as folkloric curiosities, but as metaphors that expressed the complex relationship between the community and the ocean that simultaneously sustained and threatened its existence. What made these experiences truly special, as several participants commented later, was the way Hope intertwined scientific knowledge, cultural traditions, and her own deeply personal connection with the sea. It wasn't just information being transmitted, but a way of seeing the world, a lens that revealed beauty and meaning in details that would normally go unnoticed. On a particularly memorable day, when the sky was an almost impossible blue, and the exceptionally low tide had exposed a rarely visible expanse of the rocky coastline, Hope led a small group to a formation that few locals even knew about, a series of natural pools formed in the volcanic rock that created an extraordinarily diverse miniature ecosystem. While the visitors marveled at colorful anemones, tiny crabs, and the occasional starfish, Hope noticed a solitary figure observing them from a distance. A distinguished-looking man, impeccably cut gray hair, casual but clearly expensive clothes. Unlike most tourists, he didn't carry a camera or binoculars. He just observed intensely, like someone accustomed to absorbing details quickly. When the group returned to the village after the excursion, Hope wasn't particularly surprised to find the same man waiting at the small cafe near the harbor. He politely introduced himself as Francisco Montero, editor-in-chief of a travel magazine specializing in authentic destinations and unconventional experiences. "Your approach is exactly what we aim to highlight," he explained after the initial greetings. "Tourism that reveals instead of exploits, that educates instead of simply entertaining." What followed was a proposal that, just a year earlier, Hope would have immediately rejected: a lengthy article about the village, focusing on the tide walks and the underlying philosophy that Hope represented. The idea that true connections with places happen through deep knowledge, respect, and contemplative time. "I must warn you," Hope replied after carefully considering the offer, "that my approach emphasizes quality over quantity. If your magazine attracts many visitors to the village," Francisco smiled, immediately understanding her concern. "Our publication attracts a specific type of traveler, Mrs. Hope, people who value authenticity and are willing to respect the places they visit. Besides, the article would be published in the fall edition, when the high season will already be over." After discreetly consulting with community leaders, who saw the opportunity as potentially beneficial for extending the tourist season sustainably, Hope agreed to the project. In the following weeks, she worked with a respectful and attentive photographer who documented not only the spectacular landscapes, but also the small details that Hope had taught her groups to appreciate: the specific texture of certain coastal lichens, the pattern of the waves in a sheltered cove, the wrinkled hands of fishermen mending nets using centuries-old techniques. Summer progressed, and with it, the manuscript of the Tide Archives progressed towards publication. Mrs. Blues frequently appeared at the cottage with page proofs for Hope to review, text and illustrations harmoniously combined to capture the essence of the collected knowledge. On hot afternoons, the two women worked side by side on the porch, occasionally interrupted by local residents bringing new stories or clarifications to include in the project. On one of those afternoons, when the heat had given way to a refreshing breeze coming from the sea, Mrs. Luss revealed something she had been considering for some time. "I'm thinking of staying permanently, buying that little fisherman's house that's for sale on the north side of the bay." Hope looked up from the proofs she was reviewing, studying her friend's face. She had known Luce as an artistic nomad, someone who moved from place to place seeking inspiration. The idea that she would put down roots in the village was surprising, but at the same time, strangely fitting. "What changed?" Hope asked softly. Luce contemplated the horizon for a moment before answering. "Perhaps the same thing that changed for you when Sky appeared. I found a place where my skills are needed, where my work has purpose beyond myself." She paused, smiling shyly. "And maybe I also found people who make this place feel like home." Hope understood perfectly. In recent months, she had witnessed how Luce had naturally integrated into the community, offering art classes to local children, helping to revitalize shop fronts with murals celebrating maritime traditions, gradually becoming as much a part of the landscape as the seagulls and waves. The transition from outsider to community member wasn't exclusive to Luce. Hope had also experienced that evolution, although differently. Not as someone arriving from outside, but as someone who had always been physically present, but emotionally distant, now finally allowing herself true participation in collective life. When August came to an end, bringing with it the first signs of the coming autumn, two significant events occurred almost simultaneously. The publication of the book, Tide Archives, Memories and Wisdom of a Coastal Village, and the launch of the travel magazine containing the article about Hope's tide walks. The timing created a wave of interest in the village that exceeded the most optimistic expectations. The small community maritime museum, established in a carefully restored old fishing warehouse, was inaugurated with an exhibition that combined historical artifacts, contemporary photographs, and Hope's sculptures of marine debris as central elements of the design. On a memorable night when the whole community gathered to celebrate these achievements, Hope found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the contrast between her present and her recent past. Just 2 years earlier, she had been the solitary figure walking along the deserted beach at sunset, her existence as parallel to the village as the lines of train tracks that never meet. Now she was at the center of a network of connections that extended like concentric waves, to the immediate community, to visitors who carried her stories to distant places, to readers who would never set foot on that coast but would still be touched by the preserved knowledge. During the celebration, old Mr. Miguel, now considerably more frail but with eyes shining with satisfaction, took Hope's hands in his. "Do you see what has happened?" he asked in a voice raspy with emotion. "You've woven something more valuable than any fishing net, a bridge between what we were, what we are, and what we will be." Hope didn't answer immediately, the words trapped behind an emotion that threatened to overflow. Finally, she nodded. We all wove it together. Later that night, when the festivities had subsided and most of the guests had left, Hope walked alone to the beach, following the familiar path she had walked so many times in solitude. The full moon created a silver path on the water, so bright it almost seemed solid. She sat on the sand, still warm from the day's heat, took the small spiral shell from her pocket, and held it against the moonlight. Time had gently worn its edges, but the spiral remained perfect, a form that repeated itself throughout nature, from galaxies to DNA, representing growth without losing its original essence. Hope smiled as she recognized that her own life had followed a similar pattern, gradually expanding from an isolated center toward a broader interconnection without abandoning who she fundamentally was. A familiar sound caught her attention, the beating of powerful wings cutting through the night air. She looked up, her heart quickening with anticipation. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the familiar silhouette of an eagle against the starry sky, its wings outstretched in a silent greeting before disappearing towards the mountains. Perhaps it was just a night seagull, or a product of her imagination inspired by the day's emotion. But Hope preferred to believe it was Sky, returning briefly to check that she was okay, to see what had become of the solitary woman who had once saved him. "And I to you, my friend," she whispered to the salty air. "You've returned to your freedom, and I've found mine." At dawn, when the first fishermen began their day and the village slowly awoke to a new day, Hope was already in her cottage, sitting at her work table. With steady hands, despite her years, she began to organize materials for a new sculpture, one that would represent not only the individual beauty of the elements the sea had deposited on her beach, but the interconnection between them all, the invisible but resilient network that united each fragment with the others. Through the open window, the sound of the waves came like a constant breath, reminding her that the tides of life would continue to bring and take, connect and separate, create and undo. But now, after the eagle's flight and the village's flood, after shared stories and built bridges, Hope had learned to navigate those tides with grace and purpose. The woman who had once existed in parallel to life, observing it from the safe distance of her self-imposed solitude, was now part of its ebb and flow. Without losing her contemplative essence, without renouncing the moments of solitude she still valued, she had found her place in the broader network of human connections, giving and receiving, teaching and learning, preserving and transforming. The spiral shell now rested on the windowsill, catching the first rays of the rising sun that passed through its calcareous structure, as if it were a natural prism, decomposing the light into tiny rainbows that danced on the cottage walls. Hope observed this phenomenon with a smile, recognizing in it a perfect metaphor, how the seemingly simple could contain unexpected complexity and beauty when allowed to shine. Outside, the waves continued their eternal dialogue with the shore. The village awoke with the familiar sounds of fishermen preparing their nets, of children laughing on their way to school, of vendors arranging their stalls in the market, sounds that she had once kept at a distance and that now formed part of the sound texture of her existence. With the wisdom acquired through her long journey from isolation to connection, Hope now understood that true strength didn't lie in absolute self-sufficiency, but in the delicate balance between independence and interdependence. Like the eagle that needs both the unlimited sky and the occasional shelter, like the sea that is both infinitely vast and profoundly connected to every coast it touches. The coming months and years would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new storms, new unexpected encounters. The book would continue to expand with new stories. The museum would grow with new artifacts. Visitors would come and go with the seasons. Mrs. Luz would stay, becoming a permanent part of the community fabric, while others would leave, carrying with them seeds of the stories and traditions they had witnessed. And through it all, Hope would remain, not as the isolated woman of the past, but as a point of connection, a human lighthouse that united past and future, tradition and innovation, memory and possibility, like the spiral shell, continuously growing while maintaining its essential form, expanding without losing its center. Perhaps one day, when her own steps became too heavy to traverse the beaches and cliffs, other hands would take the reins of the tidewalks, other voices would narrate the stories she had helped preserve, and this too would be part of the natural cycle of the ebb and flow that governed not only the waters but all of life. Meanwhile, there was a new day waiting to be lived, new stories waiting to be told, new fragments of beauty waiting to be discovered among the gifts that the sea left on the sand. Hope rose from her table, tucked the small shell into the pocket of her apron, and prepared to descend to the beach once more, not as a distant observer, but as an active participant in the great interconnected fabric of existence. For she had learned, thanks to a wounded eagle and an unexpected storm, that life is not designed to be contemplated from the safety of a cottage on the hill, but to be lived fully, with all its uncertainties and wonders, with all its connections and separations, with all its high and low tides. And in that knowledge, in that acceptance, she had found a deeper and more authentic peace than any isolation could provide, the peace that comes not from avoiding life's storms, but from learning to navigate through them, sustained by the invisible but unbreakable strength of human connections and the infinite capacity of the heart to heal, grow, and find beauty even in the smallest fragments that life leaves on our shore. My friends, we've reached the end of the story. Did you enjoy it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. Until next time.